Because Elara Vance was a woman built of sharp edges and quiet determination, her pragmatism a fortress against the recent wreckage of her life. A brutal breakup had left her heart a jagged scar, followed swiftly by the sudden, inexplicable death of her younger sister, a loss that had hollowed her out, leaving only an echo where joy once resided. She sought not solace, but oblivion, a place where the world's noise couldn't penetrate, where grief couldn't find purchase. The advertisement for a solitary, months-long restoration project on a remote lighthouse had felt less like an opportunity and more like a lifeline, a self-imposed exile she craved. Her emotional fragility, however, remained a ticking time bomb beneath her composed exterior. The destination was Blackwood Point Lighthouse, perched precariously on a jagged, isolated stretch of coastline known ominously as the Widow's Teeth. Locals whispered of its eerie silence, of treacherous currents that dragged ships to their doom, and of a chilling history of unexplained disappearances. Entire fishing crews swallowed by the fog, never to return. Elara, ever the pragmatist, dismissed these tales as morbid folklore, a convenient narrative for the grieving, much like her own. They were just stories, she told herself, a coping mechanism for a world that offered no easy answers. The initial journey to Blackwood Point was fraught with foreboding. The sea, usually a calming presence to Elara, churned with an unnatural, dark energy, its waves crashing against the craggy cliffs with a hungry roar. Silas, the grizzled, taciturn boatman, navigated the choppy waters with an unsettling proficiency, his weathered face a mask of profound pity mixed with an ancient fear that seemed to cling to him like the salt spray. As they approached the lighthouse, a gaunt, skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the bruised sky, Silas's voice, raspy from years of sea air, broke the silence. "The light," he muttered, his gaze fixed on the distant structure. "It calls you home, but it never lets you leave." The words, though vague, settled in Elara's stomach like a stone, a premonition she tried to shake off. Upon arrival, the lighthouse felt less like a monument and more like a tomb. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of brine and decay, and the silence was profound, broken only by the relentless crashing of waves against the rocks below and that faint, almost imperceptible, rhythmic thump-thump that seemed to emanate from deep within the structure itself. Elara dismissed the pervasive, bone-deep chill as mere dampness, a consequence of the sea air and the lighthouse's age. Yet the feeling of being watched was immediate and oppressive, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck that no rational explanation could dispel. As Silas prepared to depart, his eyes, surprisingly gentle, met hers. He reached into his worn coat pocket and produced a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. It was a common local good luck charm, she knew. "For company," he said, pressing it into her hand. "You'll need it." The gesture, meant to be comforting, was instead oddly unsettling. Elara had come here for absolute solitude, for the quiet oblivion she craved. The bird felt like an intrusion, a subtle invasion of the very isolation she had sought, hinting at a need she refused to acknowledge. She watched Silas's boat disappear into the swirling mists. The wooden bird clutched tightly in her palm, its smooth surface surprisingly cold. The first few days at Blackwood Point passed in a blur of methodical labor. Elara, a meticulous restorer, found a fragile solace in the arduous routine of chipping away salt corrosion, polishing tarnished brass, and cataloging the lighthouse's ancient components. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction, a way to silence the clamor of her grief, initially providing the oblivion she had craved. But the peculiar occurrences, subtle at first, began to escalate with an unsettling rapidity, chipping away at her carefully constructed composure. It started with the whispers, faint, ethereal, carried on the wind that whistled through the lighthouse's ancient stones. They began to sound less like the sea and more like specific, distorted names. Liam, Chloe, names she recognized from her past losses, twisted into agonizing echoes. She'd pause, tools in hand, straining to hear, but the sounds would dissipate, leaving only the roar of the ocean. Shadows, too, didn't just shift with the changing light. They coalesced into fleeting, humanoid shapes in her peripheral vision. A hunched figure in the stairwell, a tall, slender form by the lantern room window. When she turned, they were gone, leaving only the empty space and a lingering icy chill. And the scent. The pervasive smell of salt and decay, typical of a coastal structure, now had an underlying, sickening sweetness, like rotting flowers left too long in a closed room. A cloying, unnatural perfume that made her stomach clench. During her restoration work, every discovery felt less like an archaeological find and more like a deliberate warning. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the keeper's living quarters, she found a child's worn, single shoe, its leather cracked and stiff with age, too small for any adult. Later, while cleaning a dusty shelf, a faded, water-damaged daguerreotype slid out from behind a stack of old logbooks. It depicted a stern-faced lighthouse keeper, his eyes unervingly blank, almost milky, as if the light had been drained from them. Most disturbing of all, lodged deep in a crevice near the base of the central column, she found a single tarnished brass button, clutched in the desiccated, tiny skeleton of what looked like a small bird. Each item seemed to hum with a silent, terrible history, a narrative of loss and unspoken dread. The lighthouse's ancient lamp, the very heart of the structure she was meant to restore, became a focal point of her growing unease. It didn't just flicker. It ignited spontaneously, often in the dead of night when no power sources connected, with a blinding, cold light that casts grotesque, elongated shadows of unseen forms across the curved walls of the lantern room. The light seemed to possess a malevolent sentience, responding to her emotional state, flaring brighter, more aggressively, when she was distressed or afraid. It was as if the lighthouse itself was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with her unraveling. Ilara's rationalizations became increasingly strained, thin veneers over a growing terror. She attributed the events to extreme fatigue from the demanding work, the crushing isolation that warped perception, or simply the creaking of an ancient settling structure. Yet, A gnawing, terrifying doubt took root, burrowing deep into her mind. She found herself talking to herself more often, arguing with the silence, trying to find logical explanations aloud. She'd catch herself staring blankly at walls, her breath held as if expecting something to appear, something undeniable. Then came the new whispers, the most insidious yet. They began to mimic her own inner thoughts, her most private anxieties and fears, distorted and insidious. You're alone, Ilara, always alone. Or chillingly, you couldn't save them, could you? Sometimes it was even her own voice, a perfect, chilling imitation, whispering directly into her ear when no one was there. The line between external phenomenon and internal breakdown blurred, making her question if she was unknowingly manifesting the horrors herself, or if the entity, whatever it was directly invading the deepest recesses of her mind, twisting her grief into a weapon against her. The wooden bird Silas had left, still clutched in her hand during her restless sleep, felt less like a charm and more like a tiny, cold accusation. The unsettling occurrences of Chapter 2 had chipped away at Ilara's pragmatism, leaving her increasingly frayed. The whispers, now mimicking her own thoughts, were a constant, insidious companion. It was this creeping psychological erosion that led her to the keeper's quarters, a room she had, until now, largely avoided. It felt heavier, colder than the rest of the lighthouse, a place where secrets festered. While meticulously cleaning a grimy section of the wall near an old, disused fireplace, her fingers brushed against a loose brick. Curiosity, a dangerous instinct in this place, compelled her to pry it open. Inside the hidden compartment, nestled in a shroud of dust and cobwebs, lay a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked, its pages warped by damp, and a dark, rust-colored stain, unmistakably dried blood, marred the front. The name Elias Thorne was faintly etched into the leather. Elias Thorne, the last known keeper of Blackwood Point, who had vanished without a trace decades ago, swallowed by the very mystery Ilara had dismissed as folklore. As Ilara began to read, the journal became a horrifying mirror. Elias's early entries were mundane, detailing weather patterns and lamp maintenance. But quickly, the tone shifted. His handwriting, initially neat, grew increasingly erratic, slanting wildly across the pages. Words underscored multiple times, sometimes dissolving into frantic scribbles. He wrote of an unseen presence, a darkness that feeds on the light, and his desperate, increasingly futile attempts to keep the lamp burning to ward off something from the sea. His descriptions of the phenomena chillingly echoed her own. The whispers that mimicked his loved ones' voices, the shifting shadows, the inexplicable cold. He sketched swirling, tentacled shapes in the margins, crude but terrifying, and scrawled desperate pleas. Keep the light. Keep it burning. Ilara found chilling, undeniable parallels between Elias's experiences and her own unraveling sanity. He described the exact same whispers, the same shifting shadows, and a growing, consuming fear of the darkness beyond the light. She tried to dismiss it as a shared delusion induced by isolation, a historical echo of madness. But the journal's grip on her mind tightened, pulling her deeper into Elias's torment, mirroring her own descent. It was as if his fear was seeping from the pages, infecting her. She was engrossed in a particularly frantic entry, Elias raving about the thing in the deep and its hunger for the light, when a significant, undeniable paranormal event occurred. The journal itself began to vibrate violently in her hands, its leather cover trembling. From the deepest bowels of the lighthouse, a terrifying, guttural moan echoed, a sound that was both ancient and utterly despairing, vibrating through the very stone beneath her feet. Before she could react, the heavy iron door to the lantern room, 3 floors above, slammed shut with tremendous force, a sound reverberating through the entire structure like a thunderclap. This was followed by the sickening, dragging sound of something impossibly heavy being pulled across the stone floor above, a wet, scraping noise that made her skin crawl. Driven by a mix of terror and a desperate need to understand, Alara scrambled up the winding stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air grew colder with each step. When she finally reached the lantern room, forcing open the heavy door that now seemed to resist her, a wave of nauseating, sweet decay washed over her. The entire lantern room was covered in a thin, glistening, slimy residue, like something dredged from the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. And the glass of the ancient lamp, the very heart of the lighthouse, was cracked, a jagged fissure spreading from its base, as if struck by an immense, unseen force from within. As Alara stared at the cracked lamp, a new, horrifying realization dawned. Her eyes fell back to Elias's journal, still clutched in her trembling hand. She flipped back to the final, most incoherent entries, her breath catching in her throat. Amidst the scrawled warnings and desperate pleas, she saw it, passages written directly to her. Elara, one entry read, the ink faded but distinct. She will come. The light calls her. Another, almost illegible, warned. The bird, he knows. Don't trust the bird. Elias Thorne hadn't just recorded his madness. He had known she would come. Time within the lighthouse, she realized with a chilling dread, was not linear. The journal wasn't just a record of the past. It was a conversation across decades, a desperate warning from a man who knew her fate before she did. The wooden bird Silas had given her, now lying forgotten on the floor, suddenly felt like a sinister omen. The events of the previous night, the vibrating journal, the guttural moan, the slammed door, and the sickening residue in the lantern room had shattered the last remnants of Alara's rational defenses. The crack in the lamp's glass felt like a crack in her own sanity. The journal, with its direct, temporal defiance, had confirmed her darkest fears. This was no mere haunting, and she was no longer alone. The haunting intensified into a direct, malevolent assault. Objects were no longer just moved. They were hurled across rooms with violent force, shattering against stone walls. A heavy brass telescope crashed from its stand, narrowly missing her head. Cold spots became pockets of absolute, bone-chilling frost that clung to her skin, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably, even wrapped in layers of blankets. The whispers, now constant, were no longer just echoes of her thoughts. They formed coherent, chilling phrases, dripping with malice. Let the light die, Alara. Peace awaits. Or more cruelly, you failed them. Let go. They taunted her with her past losses, twisting her grief into a weapon, promising her an end to the torment if she just let the light die. The lighthouse's ancient lamp, the very object of her restoration, pulsed erratically, its beam flickering with a malevolent, internal light. Sometimes it would go dark for agonizing seconds, plunging her into absolute, suffocating blackness, a darkness that felt alive, pressing in on her, before flaring back to life with a blinding, cold intensity. Ilara's sleep became almost non-existent, replaced by vivid, terrifying nightmares that felt horrifyingly real, bleeding into her waking hours. She relived her personal tragedies, the cold, dismissive look on Liam's face as he walked away, the sudden, silent phone call about Chloe, but with the entity's presence woven into them, twisting her memories into grotesque, unbearable torments. She saw spectral figures of her lost loved ones, their faces contorted in agony, their eyes hollow, their voices echoing the entity's pleas. Turn it off, Ilara. Set us free. Her grip on sanity frayed, unraveling thread by thread. She began to hallucinate during waking hours, seeing fleeting, grotesque forms in the corners of her eyes, shapes that writhed and pulsed just beyond the edge of her vision. She would find herself staring blankly at the churning sea, convinced she saw faces in the waves, or hear phantom footsteps ascending the winding stairs behind her. Desperate, Ilara tried to contact the mainland. She fumbled with the ancient radio, but its wires were inexplicably shredded, as if torn apart by something with immense strength. Her small boat, her only escape, was found smashed against the jagged rocks below, its hull ripped open as if by enormous claws, a silent testament to the lighthouse's malevolent will. The weather, as if in league with the entity, turned into a violent, unending storm, a furious tempest that completely cut off Blackwood Point from the outside world. The waves crashed against the cliffs with the force of a battering ram, and the wind howled like a banshee, drowning out all other sounds. Then, during a brief, deceptive lull in the storm, a faint light appeared on the horizon. It was Silas, the grizzled boatman, attempting a daring, foolish rescue. He had returned, perhaps driven by a premonition or a desperate sense of responsibility. Ilara ran to the highest accessible window, screaming his name, her voice ripped away by the wind. His small vessel, a tiny speck against the churning gray, fought valiantly against the waves. But then, an unseen force, a colossal, dark mass that briefly broke the surface of the water just offshore, rose up. It wasn't a wave. It was something else. It slammed into Silas's boat with impossible speed, capsizing it instantly. Ilara watched, helpless and screaming, as his lantern, a tiny beacon of hope, went out, swallowed by the churning, black waves. The lighthouse's will to keep her trapped is now undeniable and deadly, its power extending beyond its stone walls into the very sea itself. The horrifying clarity hit Alara like a physical blow. The lighthouse wasn't just haunted. It was a sentient, malevolent prison, actively preventing her from leaving. It had a will of its own, tied to its terrifying purpose of keeping something contained within its walls. And it needed her to maintain that prison. She was the next keeper, the next sacrifice. Days after Silas's death, as if to underscore his final desperate attempt, a battered, empty wooden bird, identical to the one he had given her, washed ashore near the lighthouse. Its once intricate carvings were worn smooth by the sea. Inside a tiny, hollowed-out compartment, Alara found a rolled-up, almost illegible note from Silas, written in a frantic, desperate hand, the ink smeared by seawater. It's not the light that keeps it out. It's the sacrifice. The words chilled her to the bone, a grim prophecy of her own impending fate. The chilling revelation from Silas's note, coupled with the escalating, undeniable assaults of the lighthouse, had pushed Alara past the brink of mere fear into a desperate, frantic need for answers. Elias Thorne's journal, now more than just a madman's ramblings, became her only guide. She returned to the keeper's quarters, the blood stain on the journal's cover now seeming to pulsate with a sinister energy. She flipped through the remaining pages, her fingers trembling, searching for the final, most cryptic entries. It was there, scrawled in a hand almost completely consumed by madness, that she found it. Elias's last words were not just a confession of his torment, but a horrifying unveiling. He wrote of the great deep of a cosmic entity that predated humanity, a being of pure darkness and malevolence that had been drawn to Blackwood Point centuries ago, not by the lighthouse's light, but by a primordial rift in the ocean floor beneath it. The lighthouse, he revealed, was never meant to guide ships. It was a prison for this ancient cosmic entity. Its beam, far from being a simple navigational aid, was a concentrated barrier of pure, focused energy, constantly sealing the rift and keeping the monstrous hunger of the entity at bay. The journal entry was accompanied by a crude, yet terrifying, sketch of the lighthouse's foundation, showing a swirling vortex beneath it, from which grotesque tentacles reached upwards. As Alara read, the words seemed to burn into her mind, not just from the page, but from within. A horrifying, forced vision, sharp and agonizing, tore through her consciousness, induced by the entity itself. She saw the vast, inky blackness of the abyssal depths, felt the crushing pressure, and then the entity. It was not a ghost in the traditional sense, but a vast, amorphous shadow, writhing with countless eyes and appendages, pressing against the very fabric of reality just beyond the beam of the light. It was a being of pure malevolence, ancient beyond comprehension, hungering for light and life, its presence a suffocating weight. This vision confirmed the terrifying truth. The ghost isn't Elias Thorne, nor is it merely a manifestation of the lighthouse. It was the ancient entity itself, or a powerful psychic projection of it, attempting to manipulate Alara into extinguishing the light and releasing it into the world. But then, another layer of understanding, a fleeting, desperate clarity, pierced through the entity's oppressive influence. Elias Thorne's spirit, a tortured echo within the lighthouse, was also present. The whispers she had heard, the ones that mimicked her own thoughts, were a cacophony of both the entity's seductive lies and Elias's frantic, fragmented pleas for her to resist. He wasn't haunting her. He was warning her. His final entries, the ones that spoke directly to her, were not a sign of his madness, but a desperate attempt to pass on the truth, to prevent her from repeating his fate. Elara learned Elias didn't vanish. He succumbed to the entity's overwhelming psychological influence, driven to madness and eventually sacrificing himself. He had become a living battery for the light, his life force slowly consumed to maintain the seal, to keep the entity from breaking free. His final, agonizing act was an attempt to leave a warning for the next keeper, a warning meant specifically for her. The entity's presence in the lantern room became overwhelming. It manifested as a suffocating presence, filling the space with an unbearable, soul-numbing cold. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something alien and ancient. A sound like 1,000 voices screaming in unison, a chorus of tormented souls, echoed through the chamber, all demanding the light be extinguished. The lamp, already cracked, pulsed violently, its beam flickering, threatening to die. And then, the ultimate horrifying twist solidified in Elara's mind, a realization far more terrifying than any ghost. The entity wasn't just trapped by the light, it was trapped within the light itself. Ori's the light, and the lighthouse is merely a conduit, a physical manifestation of its confinement. Turning off the light wouldn't release it from the lighthouse. It would release it into the world through Elara, using her as a new vessel, a new host. Elias's journal entries about feeding the light took on a terrifying new meaning. The light required a sacrifice to maintain the seal, a life force to keep the entity contained. Elara was not just a restorer. She was the next offering. The horrifying truth revealed in Chapter 5, that the light was a prison, and she its next intended keeper. Its next sacrifice shattered Elara's grip on reality completely. The thin veneer of her sanity, already cracked by isolation and terror, crumbled into 1,000 shards. The lighthouse, once a refuge, was now a sentient, malevolent entity, and she was trapped within its living maw. Her paranoia consumed her. She saw the entity everywhere, not just in the shifting shadows or the reflections of the glass, but in the very patterns on the walls, in the swirling dust motes, in her own distorted reflection in the polished brass. Its seductive or terrifying whispers were no longer intermittent. They were a constant, cacophonous roar in her mind, 1,000 voices screaming, pleading, and commanding. Let go, Elara. Join us. Be free. Or, more insidiously, your sister misses you. Liam waits. Just turn it off. She began to doubt her own name, her past, her very existence. Was she Elara Vance, or merely another echo in this stone tomb? The responsibility of keeping the light burning became an unbearable, torturous weight. Every flicker, every dimming of the lamp was a physical agony, a direct drain on her own life force. She understood Elias's torment now, feeling his madness merge with her own, a shared burden of cosmic horror. The entity tempted her relentlessly with visions of her lost loved ones, vivid and agonizingly real. Chloe, laughing, her hand outstretched. Liam, smiling, his eyes full of the warmth she'd once known. They were alive, happy. If only she let the light go. If only she ceased her futile struggle. A fierce, agonizing battle raged within Ilara, not just against the external entity, but against her own deteriorating mind. Her primal instinct for survival clashes with the entity's overwhelming psychological assault, which promised release from the crushing weight of her grief. She physically fought against her own hands, which sometimes seemed to move independently, reaching for the lamp's controls. She screamed at the illusions, her voice raw and hoarse, slamming her head against the cold stone walls in desperate attempts to clear her mind, to distinguish reality from the insidious delusions. In her desperate attempts to distinguish reality from delusion, or to prove she was still alive and fighting, she began to engage in self-destructive behavior. She found a rusty nail and with trembling hands began to carve Elias's warnings into her own skin, the pain a sharp, grounding counterpoint to the mental chaos. Not the light, she scratched onto her forearm, the blood welling up, the sacrifice. She would repeatedly expose herself to the very edge of the light beam, enduring the entity's terrifying proximity, the suffocating cold, the overwhelming whispers, hoping the physical pain and sensory overload would somehow ground her, prove she was still herself. Then came the most terrifying, unexpected event. While in a deep hallucinatory state, staring into the lamp's cracked glass, Ilara saw herself in the reflections not as herself, but as Elias Thorne, his eyes wide with terror and despair, his face gaunt and ravaged by the same madness that was now consuming her. His spectral image moved with her, mimicking her actions, a chilling premonition of her fate. And as she watched this horrifying transformation, she discovered a strange glowing symbol, identical to one sketched in Elias's journal, has appeared on her own skin, just above her heart. It pulsates faintly with the light of the lamp, a brand, a mark of ownership, confirming that she was not just trapped, but becoming part of the lighthouse's terrifying, eternal mechanism. The light was not just a prison. It was a parasitic life force, and she was its new host. The glowing symbol on Ilara's skin pulsed with an agonizing rhythm, mirroring the erratic beat of the lighthouse lamp. Her mind was a battlefield, Elias Thorne's despair battling the entity's seductive promises, her own grief a heavy anchor dragging her down. But deep within the shattered fragments of her sanity, a primal flicker of resolve ignited. She was not Elias. She would not be another sacrifice. She would fight. The entity, sensing her defiance, launched its most direct and powerful assault. The lighthouse itself seemed to become a living, screaming thing. A guttural groan, deeper and more resonant than anything before, vibrated through the stone, shaking the very foundations. Cracks thin as spiderwebs and wide as fissures began to appear in the ancient walls, weeping a black, viscous fluid that smelled of the deep ocean and something utterly alien. The air in the lantern room became a tangible, suffocating presence, pressing in on Ilara, trying to physically force her hand towards the lamp's controls. It manifested not just as a shadow, but as a swirling vortex of inky blackness filled with countless, unblinking eyes that stared into her soul, and sinuous appendages that seemed to reach out, brushing against her, leaving trails of icy dread. Despite her shattered mental state and physical exhaustion, Ilara found her last vestiges of strength. Elias's journal, stained with his blood and warnings, became her weapon. She remembered his frantic sketches of seals and symbols, his desperate pleas to keep the light. She knew the lighthouse's ancient mechanics, its intricate gears and levers, from her restoration work. This was not just a physical struggle. It was a battle of wills, of knowledge against primal horror. She screamed, a raw, defiant sound that tore through the entity's whispers. Channeling her grief, not into surrender, but into a furious, burning resolve, she began a desperate, almost ritualistic act. With trembling hands, she smeared the black, bleeding fluid from the walls over the glowing symbol on her chest, transforming the mark of ownership into a defiant shield. She recalled Elias's obscure references to binding the light. Ignoring the entity's screams of rage, she began to manipulate the lamp's mechanisms, not to turn it off, but to overcharge it, to force more power, more life, into its beam than it was ever meant to hold. Her own blood, still seeping from the carved warnings on her arm, mixed with the residue on her skin, creating a volatile, reactive seal. This was her choice. Sacrifice herself, not by succumbing, but by becoming a living conduit, a temporary, agonizing reinforcement of the prison. Or perhaps to find a way to banish the entity back to its abyssal prison, to break the cycle. The lighthouse shuddered violently, the sounds of tearing stone and grinding metal filling the air. The lamp, protesting, flared within blinding, white-hot intensity, its light no longer cold, but burning with a searing, painful heat. The entity shrieked, a sound that ripped through Ilara's mind, forcing her to her knees. This was the brutal climax, a visceral, psychological torment, and a desperate struggle for survival and sanity. A glimmer of hope, or perhaps a final, cruel illusion, flickered. The entity, screaming, began to recede, its amorphous form recoiling from the intensified light. It was being pushed back, forced into retreat. Ilara had succeeded, at least for now. But as it retreated, melting back into the abyssal darkness from which it came, a final chilling revelation echoed in her mind. A voice that was not Elias's, not her own, but something ancient and mocking. Fool, this was merely one. The light is not a prison, but a beacon. You have only sealed this one. Others will come. They always do. The outcome of the confrontation was revealed. The entity was temporarily repelled, but not destroyed, leaving a terrifying promise of return. Ilara had succeeded in sealing it away, but at a terrible, irreversible personal cost. Her sanity was a fragile construct. Her ability to ever truly escape the lighthouse's influence, now a terrifying question. Her physical form felt irrevocably altered, the glowing symbol on her chest now burning with a constant internal heat. The light she had fought to preserve, The very thing that had consumed Elias Thorne now felt like a curse, an eternal burden. The aftermath of the final elimination was a terrifying blur. Alara awoke, or so she believed, to the sound of distant gulls and the gentle rocking of a boat. She was no longer in the lighthouse, but on a small, bewildered fishing vessel, its crew staring at her with a mixture of awe and profound pity. Her escape, if it was one, had left her fundamentally, irrevocably changed. Her once vibrant auburn hair was now streaked with stark white, framing a face etched with lines of unimaginable terror. Her eyes, once sharp and determined, were haunted, wide and unfocused, seeing things others could not. Her body was covered in self-inflicted scars from her desperate attempts to ground herself, and a strange, glowing symbol above her heart still pulsed faintly, a constant reminder of the parasitic bond. She was a shell of her former self, forever marked by the entity, a living testament to the horrors of Blackwood Point. She tried to explain what had happened, the ancient entity, the lighthouse's true purpose, Elias's journal, Silas's sacrifice. But her story is met with blank stares, then hushed whispers, and finally, a horrified pity. She was labeled as insane, her accounts dismissed as the ravings of a mind broken by isolation and grief. The authorities, when they finally arrived, spoke of a severe mental breakdown, of hallucinations induced by extreme stress. She carried the burden of the truth alone, a silent scream trapped within her, unheard by a world that preferred comforting lies to terrifying realities. The lighthouse's legacy remained ambiguous. Blackwood Point Lighthouse still stood, seemingly normal, a stoic sentinel against the churning sea. Its light, now restored and burning steadily, seemed to mock her. Its dark secret remained, perhaps waiting for the next unsuspecting keeper, the next soul drawn to its deceptive promise of solitude. Or perhaps her final act had indeed destroyed something, but the entity was merely displaced, its influence now seeping into the surrounding waters, infecting the very currents, or more terrifyingly, into Alara herself. The chilling ambiguity of the ending left the reader questioning everything. Was Alara truly sane? Was the entity ever truly contained, or did it merely retreat, biding its time? Had she truly escaped, or was a part of the lighthouse's darkness now residing within her? A ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The last light could refer to the physical light of the lighthouse, now burning again, but tainted. It could refer to her shattered sanity, a fragile flicker constantly threatened by the lingering shadow of the entity. Or, most chillingly, it could refer to the last flicker of humanity within her, slowly being consumed by the cosmic horror she had faced. The final image was Alara, years later, found staring out at the vast, indifferent sea, seeing something others cannot. Her eyes fixed on a distant point where the horizon met the abyss, forever bound to Blackwood Point. Alara is rescued and brought back to civilization, seemingly safe. She is placed in a quiet, sterile room, given medication, and told she is recovering. She sees familiar faces, her parents, Liam, who visit her, their smiles reassuring. She begins to believe she is truly safe, that it was all a delusion. However, the final scene reveals the horrifying truth. She is actually still inside the lighthouse, or a mental prison created by the entity, endlessly reliving the events, trapped in a perfected form of torment. The rescue, the familiar faces, the normalcy, were all the entity's ultimate delusion, a cruel, inescapable nightmare. The last light was not the lighthouse's being, but the last flicker of her own, now extinguished, sanity. The wooden bird Silas left behind, the one she believed she'd dropped, is found clutched tightly in her hand, but it's now a desiccated skeletal remains, mirroring the one she found earlier in the lighthouse, a final, horrifying confirmation that she never truly left. She is the lighthouse, and the lighthouse is her.